Alright, my young JavaScript ninjas, let's get into our first real topic, which is introducing you to the Node.js to AngularJS stack, which we call our web development framework. Alright? So the focus of this lecture is really going to be on, as I said, that web development framework. So we'll talk about the components that a web developer uses to create web applications, or those killer applications that you use, and the pieces of it that range from Node.js to AngularJS. Now, we won't focus as much on the AngularJS side of things because that really relates to the client side, which is what you'll take if you haven't taken it yet, client-side JavaScript. All right, but we'll talk about Node.js up until that point, and maybe throw in a little bit of AngularJS just for your personal edification. Alright, so the main components that we'll talk about in this lecture are the user, the browser, this thing called a web server, and the back-end services that provide the information to our application. So just what is this whole thing about? Well, let's look at this diagram. Alright, so here on the left we have our user, and our user is Jill, and Jill interacts with our website or our web application via her browser. Alright. On the browser, we have certain things running, like our JavaScript, our client-side JavaScript, to be exact, and JSON, the DOM, the document object model, HTML, CSS, images, and any user interaction such as mouse clicks, taps, swipes, etc. All right, so that's the browser side of things. Now, on this right side, we see what's called a server. All right, so this relationship is what we call a client-server relationship. The client is the web browser, and the server side are things that exist on the back end at our company or in the cloud, etc. And the server side is really what this class is all about. Now, the interaction between the two is what we call an HTTP request and response. So your browser is going to request the information, HTML, CSS, images, etc. The web server is going to take that request in, and it's going to use these server-side scripts, which could be PHP, Java, .NET, C++, JavaScript. In our case, it's going to be JavaScript, and it's going to interact with other services such as databases, such as MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server. In our case, it's going to be MongoDB. It's going to process these requests, gather up the data, do any processing required, and then it's going to return an HTTP response to the browser, in which case the browser is going to be responsible for displaying that data that is returned back. Okay, so let's really talk about what our users are and what the user is and how the user relates to this development framework. All right, there's absolutely no reason for our website or web application existing without the user. Right? We build everything for the user, and as such, we should keep our user first and foremost when we're developing our application. It's their expectations that determine the requirements of our application. What does our user expect to do? If you look at D2L, does D2L do everything that a user, i.e. a teacher or a student, would expect from an online learning environment? Some would say yes, some would say no. All right. The user's role is to actually view the results of the web framework processing. So remember, I just previously talked about the web server side of it, taking in the information, processing it, blah blah blah. So when that result comes back, the user wants to view that result, and then they're going to provide interactions with those results, i.e. clicking on the mouse to expand it, see more information, or inputting transactional information so they can transfer funds from one account to the other. So that's our user's goal in this, or user's role in this whole framework. The browser, all right? The browser has three roles, all right? The first role is to provide communication to and from the web server, right? So we need to be able to talk from the browser to the web server, right? To get information to and get information from, all right? So when that information comes back, we interpret, or the browser is responsible for actually interpreting that data from the server and rendering it. That's what that little web browser application does on your computer. It interprets the data from the server, which is going to come back as HTML, CSS, or JSON, etc., and it's going to what we call render or display it into a view, which is what our user is going to see. All right. It's also responsible via JavaScript for handling the user interactions through the keyboard, mouse, touchscreen, or whatever input device that is necessary, and then taking the appropriate action. So if I click on a link, the browser is responsible for sending the request to the server to get the contents of that link. So let's talk a little bit more about that browser to web server communication. How does that communication take place? All right, if you've taken client server, you already understand this part, but it takes place using what we call a series of requests using HTTP. All right, HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. All right, and basically what it does is define the communication between a browser and a web server. All right, so there's very defined messages that we use to define a request and a response. All right, HTTP is also going to define what kind of requests can be made, and it's going to define the format of those requests, all right, and a response. So HTTP is more of what we call a standard that defines how two things communicate. It's called a protocol, and protocols define communication or how things interact. Right? One other thing that HTTP can add is what we call HTTPS, which is an additional security layer, such as SSL or TLS, and we use that basically to secure our connection, right? We don't want our data in transit to be easily intercepted and read, so we'll use these technologies to secure it, right, by doing what we call providing a certificate from the server to the browser to identify itself. All right, so we have three main types of requests. We talked about those requests, three main types. We have the GET. All right, what the GET is responsible for is asking the server for information. All right, so when you type in a URL, a GET is going to be sent, and when you say index.html, that GET is going to carry that you want the index.html page, and that server is going to respond by giving you back the index.html and all the related components of it, such as the images and the JavaScript associated with it. All right, the POST request is what we use to send data to the server. So if I fill out a form or if I have a shopping cart, I'm going to use a POST to send that data to the server. All right? And AJAX is what we call asynchronous JavaScript in XML. Such a long, cool name. All right? Basically, all it is a GET or POST request, but it's done by the JavaScript that's running in the browser. And it's done in such a way that the page can continue to process while that request is being made. And that's one topic that you'll learn a lot about in client-side JavaScript if you haven't taken it yet. Alright, so how do we render the actual browser view that we talked about? Well, a screen consists of several pieces of data that have been retrieved from the web server. Remember that request I just talked about? Well, the response is going to contain several pieces of data, i.e. any images, HTML, CSS. It's all going to get sent back from the web server. So the browser is going to read that data from that URL, that response from the server, and it's going to take this HTML and render it and build what we call a document object model, or a DOM. All right, and it's really going to the most common types of data that the browser is going to render are going to be HTML files, right, which provide the structure of the document object model. We have our CSS files, and these CSS files define how each of the elements on the page are going to be styled. Is it going to be blue? Is it going to be bold? Is it going to be 12-point font, etc.? Right? It also is going to send back any client-side JavaScripts, right? These client-side scripts are what we use to enhance the functionality of the page, such as making sliders or expanding things automatically. So that's what the client-side JavaScript is responsible for. And we can also probably send back media files. These are going to be images, videos like this one, and the sound associated with it. We also send back data. Right? Data generally is going to come back in the form of XML or JSON or raw text, right? Data is information that needs to be displayed on the page. All right? And there's a little thing called HTTP headers. Headers are basically things that the browser can use to define the behavior of the web page. Now let's talk about what a web server is, and that's a very important concept. All right? The web server's job is to handle requests from the browser. All right? So when the browser sends a request, it's the web server that takes in that request and is going to handle it from there. And that's what this class is all about. All right? Most of the web servers that you'll come across, Apache, IIS, all right, are geared towards handling static files. So all a static file is just an HTML page, right, or a text file that doesn't do anything. All right, doesn't execute any logic, right? So most of them are built to handle that scenario. You just want a page that has some images and some text. That's all well and good. But we know now that our web applications do so much more. All right? So whenever we have logic behind the processing, we need to do some things, manipulate some data, right? We use what's called server-side scripts. And these server-side scripts are oftentimes written in languages like Java, Python, C, C++, C#, Perl, etc. So the main three that you'll probably see in the Tampa Bay area are going to be C#, JavaScript, or Java. All right. So what these server-side scripts do are generate a response by executing code. All right. So they actually execute this code, and this code can connect with other back-end services and provide some calculations and processing on the data that it gets. So it may talk to a database, retrieve some information, do some work on that information, right? And then that information is going to get packaged up and sent back to the browser. Now, in order for all that to happen with these server-side scripts, a lot of these web servers must be extended to handle server-side scripts. Okay? You heard me say back-end services. Well, what's a back-end services? Well, back-end services is just a set of services that run behind the web server. Those things that I just talked about. All they do is provide data used to build responsive browsers. So this includes our server-side scripts and also things like our database. Our database is a component used to store data so that it can be persistent between requests. All right, and the one we'll focus on in this class is MongoDB. All right, so here's a image of the topics that we will discuss in this class. All right, so in the browser, as you can see, that client side is mostly AngularJS. So AngularJS is a framework provided by Google, right? And what it does is it provides all the functionality that we need to handle user input in the browser, manipulate that data on the client side, all right, on the client side, and it also helps us control how our elements are displayed, all right? Uses some JavaScript, and most people would say it's a replacement. I mean, it's not JavaScript, but a replacement for jQuery. All right. So the theory behind all this AngularJS stuff is that it wants to be a framework that's making it easy for us to implement web applications using what we call the MVC design pattern, Model View Controller. We won't get into that now, but you'll learn all about Model View Controller in the client side JavaScript class. All right. Again, HTTP handles that middle part. Now, it's the server side, again, like I said, that we'll focus on in this class. The key here is good old Node.js. Well, what does Node.js do for us? All right, Node.js is our platform. All right, it's a development framework, and it's based on a technology that Google created called the V8 JavaScript engine. All right, so basically what it does is it allows us to implement these back-end services. All right, so we can implement our web server, and run it on our Node.js platform as a module. It allows us to run our server-side scripts easily. So we get a lot of things from Node.js that we'll use in this course that makes it easier for us versus, say, Apache or IIS. All right. So some of the reasons why we might want to use a Node.js is, of course, it's JavaScript from end to end. Now, I can write JavaScript in the browser, and I can write JavaScript on the server side, and that eliminates the need for learning a bunch of different languages. All right. As you'll see later, we'll talk about this thing called event-driven, right? So it enables us to handle requests from server in a slightly different way, or web requests in a slightly different way based on what we call an event model. And we'll talk about that shortly. It's very extensible. There's a very active community that develops for Node.js. Lots of different modules and plugins that we can add to extend the functionality of our server-side applications without having to write that code ourselves. And it's pretty easy to work with if you know JavaScript. All right. The data storage that I talked about is MongoDB, and that's what we'll use to store our data. It implements a concept called a NoSQL database. All right. NoSQL is very interesting, right? MongoDB is basically a library, and we'll cover some of it, not a lot of it, but it's different than the traditional relational database that you're used to because it stores everything as JSON objects, and we'll talk about JSON objects later as well. It uses these things called documents, so we consider MongoDB to be document oriented. All right, It has very good performance, very high availability, and it's very easy to scale a MongoDB across multiple servers. All right. And last but not least, we'll talk about this Express thing that you see right here in the middle. This is how we will implement our web servers. All right. That is it. Take care.